Welcome to Illuminations, a program of study designed to guide you through the basic tools one needs to become a better painter. We intend to shed light on the theories, tools, and techniques that provide this foundation. Many of the subjects we'll explore seem to confuse even experienced painters when they're trying to do everything at once. Every stroke applied to a painting must exhibit the knowledge of composition, color, value, edge, linear, and aerial perspective. That's a tall order for a beginner, yet that's exactly what many try to do when they start painting. Actually, all these concepts are simple to understand when they're studied out of the context of trying to execute a painting. Join me for the entire Illumination series for a good basic introduction to the theory, tools, methods, and techniques every painter can use. Today we're exploring ways to capture the likeness of facial features of women and young girls. Frequently, painters understand the light and dark relationships between the lighted and shadow sides of faces, but can't seem to get the right age relationships necessary to accurately represent their subjects. That's because they're not looking in specific places to observe the effects of age or youth on the face. I'm going to use these subjects today to explore some of the differences. My two models are mother and daughter, and I think you can see the resemblance between them is striking. To make this demonstration as clear as possible, I photographed both subjects in exactly the same lighting situation, that is, by the natural skylight coming in through a large window, commonly known as north light. They were not illuminated by sunlight or camera flash, or their shadows would have been harsh and hard-edged. North light, or natural light, produces soft transitions from the lighted side of the face to the shadow side. Before we start painting, let's examine these two faces for some similarities and differences. Of course, the biggest difference between adults and children is head size. To make the comparisons easier to see, I'm going to enlarge the size of the head of the little girl to the same height as the woman from crown to chin. The top of the mother's head is covered by hair, but her crown is somewhat lower than her hair. The crown of the child is clearly visible because her hair is pulled tightly around her head into braids. The length of the head is measured from the crown to the chin, as shown here. In the adult, the common measurement that locates the eyes on the head is halfway between these 2 points. This holds true for the mother, but not for the young daughter. The child's eyes lie below that halfway mark, and this is one of the most common traits in children. While it's not unusual for a child to measure right on the halfway mark, it's not the most common occurrence. So you should look for this feature in any child that has not yet reached puberty. In the adult woman, her eyebrows are fully developed both in richness of hair color and in coarseness of the individual hairs. On the little girl, however, the eyebrows are not as dark as they will be ultimately, and they are as soft as the hair on her head. Another place to observe closely is the lips. While many women have large, sensual lips, they tend to be even larger as children. As we age, the lips tend to get thinner, and in advanced age, women have very little lip mass compared to when they were young. This child will probably have lips very similar to her mother's when she reaches adulthood. Also, compare the shape of the jaw and chin between these two subjects. The adult has more angular and sharper shapes around her jaw. The child has the rounded shape of the still developing jawbone. To examine more common differences that you'll see between all adults and children, let's change these faces into a range of simple colors and values. This simplifies the planes of the face into their more specific shapes so you can see the value patterns more clearly. For the moment, I'm going to eliminate all the color so you can see the faces simply in shades of gray. We notice several things when we can see the face this simply. The value patterns are remarkably alike, but there are some telling differences. First, the values in the eye sockets tend to be darker in the adult than in the child. This is because the bone structure of the adult produces a more prominent brow bone at maturity. Second, the bridge of the nose bone is not yet fully developed in the child, and this is one of the most important places to indicate youth. Notice how the shadow runs completely down the left side of the adult nose, from eye socket to bottom of the nose. In the child, this shadow shape is broken and is not continuous. The younger the child, the lighter will be this area of the nose shadow. Finally, the neck of the child tends to be narrower compared to the head width than that of the adult. Well, that's enough observation of the photos for the moment. Let's turn to the painting process now and talk about how we translate all of that into the painted portrait. The paints I've selected for this demonstration are provided by the Mimeri Paint Company, and I'm using their Puro line of professional grade paints. These represent a selection of basic colors from which I can paint not only portraits but also landscape and still life subjects. I've chosen a minimum number of 9 colors from which I can mix almost any other color I may need. It's important to have the right basic colors on your palette, even though you may choose to have other colors for reasons of convenience. Today's palette of colors include ivory black, cupric green deep, or phthalo green, ultramarine deep, crimson lake, or alizarin crimson, cadmium red orange, transparent Mars brown, which I use instead of burnt sienna, yellow ochre, primary yellow, and titanium white. With this selection of colors, I can mix any color I'll need for the flesh tones, and they can be used to paint any color of flesh, from the darkest black to the fairest white complexions, and everything in between. The canvas that I'm using has been toned with a thin wash of ivory black and allowed to completely dry. I could paint this demonstration on white canvas, but the neutral gray will allow you to see it better in the video because of the strong lights we use here in the filming studio. A white canvas would be blinding to both me and to the cameras. The brushes I'll be using today are white bristle filberts, and you'll notice that I'm using a variety of sizes, from the smallest for detail to middle size for larger masses, and finally largest for big masses. I'll also be using 2 flat saples, one a number 4 and the larger one is a number 10, for doing some of the detail on the finishing areas of the face. Today I'm going to draw with a mixture of transparent Mars brown and ultramarine blue. This mixture will give you a color that's very similar to burnt umber, so I don't really need another brown on my palette when I can mix it this easily. I'm using my middle size white bristle filbert brush to draw with. The first thing I'll do is strike in the length of the head from the crown to the chin, and then I'll put in the width of the head. Connecting these 4 points, you can see that the shape that I've got is basically egg-shaped, and that's critical to establishing the youth of your subject. Almost all young subjects have this egg shape to their head, very dominant broad area across the top. The next thing I did was find the eye line, which was located below the halfway mark between the crown and the chin. I place the eyes and then go about placing other particular things in the drawing. The hairline will be exceedingly important, and the placement of the eyebrows. The eyebrows are important to establish that brow bone right away, even though I'm not trying to get the exact shape of my little subject's eyebrows. Just that placement of any kind of brow, the bottom of the nose and the corners of the mouth, and we already have the beginnings of the feeling of the young child. Now at this point, it should be fairly obvious that we can't tell whether it's a male or a female. And that's an important thing to remember. Most children, their gender is not found in their measurements on their head. Rather, it's found in their hairstyle and clothes more than anything else. We all know plenty of little children that if it were a male child and we put long hair on him, he could pass easily for a little girl, and vice versa. So the hair is a very important feature to establishing whether or not this child early on is a male or a female. Once we get her pigtails in down at the bottom, it'll be fairly obvious, but at this moment it could be a little boy just as easily as a little girl. There, see how that turns it immediately into a little girl. But I don't think I'm ultimately going to paint those pigtails out there, so I'm going to take them off with a damp rag and paint them a little more deliberately later on. I'll clean my palette and now begin mixing some of the important flesh tones. I'll start with white to mix my lightest flesh, beginning with white, yellow ochre, and crimson lake. These two colors together will give me a beautiful light flesh tone for the Caucasian flesh. Even if you were painting a dark subject, you might mix this color for a highlight on the flesh and mix one slightly darker for the lighter values for whatever your complexion type might be. As a matter of procedure, I always mix at least two values before I start painting. That is, the light value on the biggest light plane of the face, not necessarily the highlight, but the big light plane, and the darkest value on the shadow side of the face. Today, to keep this as simple as possible, I'm going to work with just these two values and brush mix everything else in between. My dark value is going to be a mixture of white, cad red orange, and ivory black. If you're using cad red light, that color was perfectly okay as well. I always like to choose cad red that leans toward the orange end of the scale because it tends to give me warmer flesh tones, and you can see this shadow color does have the feeling of a warm, dark flesh tone, and that's the color I'll begin with my medium-sized white bristle filbert. The first and most important thing to do is get the shape of the shadow on the face, because this is the defining point in getting the bone structure. Now, if this video were about capturing a likeness, I would be much more critical about the exact shape for the shadow structure on this little subject. But today's lesson is about how we capture the feeling of youth, so I'm not going to be focusing so much on the likeness as I am going to be on trying to get the very youthful look to our little model. But you see here, the shape of the shadow goes down that long left side, comes into the eye socket on the left, defines the inside of the left eye socket, and just the left portion of the right eye socket. We have a break in that shadow that goes down the nose, and then shadows under the nose and at the corners of the mouth. Now we're ready for the light plane. I go into the first mixture and load it generously on my brush and paint in all of the areas that we saw in our photographic reference that were the lightest plane. That's the plane that faces the light most directly. Now those planes that turn slightly away from the light but are still illuminated, I'm not going to paint those yet. I'm going to put a different color and value on that plane. And that plane is typically called the turning edge between the light and the shadow. See, this stage is very, very quick. Because I'm not worried about the likeness, I can just go in and place those big light shapes where I see them. Notice that I did paint right over the mouth area. The only part of the feature of the mouth that I laid in were the little corners. We'll come back to that much later. Now I'm mixing that value in between that's going to make the turning color. I mixed the dark and the light together, and then I warmed it up just a little bit by the addition of Cad Red Orange. That goes between the light and shadow and at the edge of the eye sockets where it turns up toward the eyebrow. The area under that left eye and down the side of the mouth area and the chin. And now we have a complete pattern of light and shadow. The next thing I'll do is take a brush and remove the edges between the light, the turning color, and the shadow. And to do that, I'll need a clean brush, so generally I won't use the brush I'm laying on paint with right now. I'll pick up a completely clean brush. Before I do that, I want to be sure that every part of the painting in the face has paint on it. You see, I just painted right over the eyebrows. Here's that clean brush, no paint on it whatsoever. It's very dry. I'm just removing some of the hard edges between the areas of the paint. When the brush leaves the canvas, I'm wiping it with a clean paper towel to get the excess paint off. Because actually what I'm doing is removing paint right now. I'm not actually laying any paint on, but I'm taking off the excess. I can do it with a brush like you've just seen, or I can do it with a palette knife. With a palette knife, I'm just going to scrape it off. That is, take the excess right off the surface and wipe it off on my paper towel. I can go right over both the light side and the dark side if I just take a simple scraping motion, and I won't remove any of the paint or move it from where it was. Now I'm going into some of the color for the hair, mixing again the Mars Brown, Ultramarine Blue, and a little bit of Yellow Ochre. Once I've got the flesh tones established, I'll immediately want to put in some of the hair color and the value of the hair, adding a little black there because that was just a little bit too brightly colored. I always tell everyone in my portrait classes that the hair should be considered as one of the other features on the head. It's just as important, if not more important, than the eyes, nose, and mouth. If you don't get that dark hair value in there to begin with, it's really difficult to know how light or dark your flesh pattern is. So you'll want to get that in right away at this early stage. It'll be a while before you see me paint in any of the features areas, that is the fun part of the eyes, nose, and mouth. I'm going to spend a great deal of time in this illustration getting the structure under those features just right before I begin. And part of that is to get the hair in and to get the size and shape of the facial mask going before we get down to that detail. It's so much fun to paint the eyes, nose, and mouth. Sometimes we forget about the larger picture. And as a painter, you really need to think about what's underneath the decoration. And in this case, it's very important to get the feeling of that soft hair growing out of the head there in the top area. We also want to be sure that the top half of the head stays larger than the lower half that contains the jaw and the jaw line. Right now she's beginning to look a little bit older than her 5 years, and I can tell you that the reason is that I haven't made the area in her head around her forehead large enough. But I'll get back to that in just a moment. Right now I want to get some of this dark reference of her pigtails down there by her neck and behind her jawline. This dark reference really thrusts the head forward and lets you see it as a flesh tone. In adding the ears, you notice that I added some cad red orange to that mixture because the ears always tend to have a redder tone to them than the rest of the flesh. That's because they protrude from the head and you can actually see light coming through them. If you've ever held your hand up to a light bulb and seen how red it is, it's because you can see all of the blood under the skin tinting what appears to be the outside of your hand. Well, the ears are the same way. So I put them in a little darker and redder than the rest of the flesh tones, and that helps them sit behind the face rather than being right up in front or in the same plane as the face. I'm going to work quite a bit in the area around the forehead where the hair joins the forehead. This area right here, the temple area in young children, tends to be very wide. So it's important to establish that early on so that you get the feeling that this is a young child. Throughout this demonstration, you'll see me come back to this area again and again to make sure that I capture that width. Because the tendency is when you're painting children, and I'll tell you this right now, once you get into painting the hair, it's so much fun, you forget about that when you pull that hair into the area of the face, you change the age appearance of the child if you cut down the size of that forehead. If you want your child to look older, then pull the hair in. If you want the child to look younger, then you increase the size of that forehead out there beyond the temples, right where the hair joins the head. Now I'm actually laying in a little bit of value to indicate where those eyebrows are going to be located. Pulling some of that down, it's not eyebrows I'm painting so much as it is the top of the opening of the eye socket. I think I got them a little bit too high, so I'm going to lower them by adding more of the light flesh tone on the light side, but when I go to the left eyebrow over there, I'm going to have to change. I can't use this same value. I'll always go back to the value that was down there originally to change a shape. And that's that turning color right in that area. Blend again. Portrait painting of any subject is a matter of laying down the basics in a very crude fashion in the beginning, and then making your successive strokes take on a more refined feeling. I know a lot of people watching sometimes when I begin a portrait think, my goodness, how on earth can she possibly get anything out of that at the end, as crude as it looks in the beginning. But this crudeness is a way of establishing the big, important shapes. The delicate shapes come much later. And sometimes some of the crudeness appears to disappear once you begin to put some very distinctive details in there. I'd like to point out that even at this early stage, with no eyes, nose, or mouth, just the shape of the skull underneath the skin, we're already beginning to get the feel of the subject. That is, we know that it's a young person. We know that the eyes have a place. We know the nose is suggested in its proper place, and the mouth. At this moment, it doesn't look quite as young as it ultimately will, particularly because the mouth appears to be just a thin little line, but we'll change that later. In fact, I think I'll just go ahead and get rid of that little line. See, just getting rid of one of those things that indicates age, which is the thin mouth, helps to bring youth to this little subject. Now, in an attempt to get a little more of her specific likeness, I noticed that her jaw is really very rounded, and it's quite long on her for her age. So I'm going to alter the shape of that jawline just a little bit before I get into any more specific details. Each time I add something, I'll go right back to the color and value that I laid it on originally. And as long as you keep this in a simple value pattern, you won't get lost. You'll always have that shadow that shows the plane that's facing away from the light, and then the light that shows the direction of the head that's next to the light, and the turning plane will have a little bit more color in it than does either the shadow or the light plane. Her nose is a little wider than what I've indicated, so I'll put a little of shadow underneath the nose and define the edge on the right hand side to give it a little bit more bulk and width. Now I'm going back to that forehead, pulling a little bit of the flesh color up into the part of the hair. When hair is parted, it does show the flesh. And notice that I'm pulling the flesh right out into the hair each time I rework that area. Sometimes you can't tell the difference between hair and flesh, and if you'll remember that hair is not a separate thing. Its highlights come right out of the flesh color. It will tend to look more lifelike. Don't think that all hair color is a completely separate thing from the colors that you're using on the flesh. Before I go any further, I think I'll get a little bit closer to the actual shape of those braids coming out from the top of the head, and give her a little more balance up there in that egg shape. The hair is such fun to paint. You can get into a mode of doing too much, so it's best to leave it and finish areas on the flesh tone that need to be addressed before you get too deeply involved in the hair. Actually, I use the hair as a resting place many times when I'm working on the face, and I get just totally saturated in looking at an area to the point that I can't see it objectively anymore. That's when I go back and paint on the hair area. But as long as I can paint big blocks of flesh area, this is an easy way to get into the painting and get something working on your canvas before you get into all of those little bitty details. And don't worry about leaving big brush marks in there. After all, this is a painting. You'll notice that later on I'll address making the softness come about as a result of blending or painting the flesh with perhaps smaller strokes. But at this point, keep it very loose and you won't tighten up as a painter. Now I'm switching to a smaller brush because I'm ready to begin addressing some of the details, and I go right for the most interesting part of the face, in my opinion. And that is going to be the eyes. I'll begin with the right side eye and place the inside corner directly above the corner of the nose. In almost every human being, that's a benchmark that you can count on. If the inside corner of the eye is closer to the center of the face than the outer wing of the nose, then you will define a facial type that's known as a thin face or a long face. This little subject, though, follows the most common measurement, and that is the inside corners of her eyes lie directly above the outer edge of the nose. And this is true for either children or adults. This is not a particular feature of just children.
frequently you'll observe that children seem to have their eyes wider than those of adults. And it's not because the eyes are located wider or placed farther apart on the head, it's because they don't have the fully developed bone of the nose between the eyes. It's rather flat, so there are no really deep shadows on the shadow side of the nose, and because that becomes then a relatively light plane across there, we think visually that it's larger than it is. If we were to break that big area between the two eyes up into a light and a dark plane, you'd see that it seems to be narrower than it is. Now what I've done is place the eyelids, the upper eyelids in with a more reddish tone. I didn't use that dark brown that I used for the hair and the placing the initial lash line for the eyelids, because that would be too dark and too brown. One thing that you want to do to keep children looking young is to keep their eyelids and all of the values around the eyes as light as you possibly can. Dark values around the eyes indicate age, and we're trying to indicate youth. Now you'll see me dip into a little bit of ultramarine blue to mix with that lightest flesh mix, and that's what I'll paint the whites of the eyes with. You never ever use white to paint the whites of the eyes. It's far too light a value. If you use ultramarine blue with your lightest flesh tone, that's plenty light enough. Children's eyes are almost always bluer than adult eyes, and now I'm talking about the whites of the eyes, not the color of the iris. That's because they don't have the capillaries of the blood coming into the eyes as much as adults do. Young people tend to have clearer, cooler whites of the eyes than adults do. Now on the shadow side of each of those eyeballs, that is on the left side, you'll notice that I painted those with a slightly darker version of the blue-white. Now I'm returning to the hair color using some Mars Brown, Ivory Black, and Ultramarine Blue to place that upper lash line. In a child, I try to keep this as low-key as possible. In an adult woman, you'd play up this area of the dark lash line in order to create more drama in her face. But because we don't have too many dark values around the eyes in a child, you don't want to play this up too much, or you'll automatically age her and make her look like she's 12 or 15 rather than 5. Try to keep the darkest area of the eyelash line right over the iris. Now, I laid in that initial crease in the lid and the lid itself with a darker red tone. Now I'm going back with some of the light flesh, and I'm going to alter that into a more subtle transition from slightly darker and redder in the inside corner, which would be on the shadow side of that eyelid, and lighter toward the outer side, where it turns toward the light. I've switched to my small flat sable brush now that I told you about a little bit earlier, because some of these areas are so tiny that you just can't work in them with that large white bristle filbert. Even the smallest size is a little bit too large in this small face. Now as you watch me work around these small areas, I want to talk to you just a bit about the way that you lay the paint on. It's important that you always put enough paint down that it will mix into what's underneath, so that you'll be able to make a smooth transition like you see me working with the brush now. We don't want really hard transitions between the light and the shadow sides on the face, or rather any light and dark area. This eye socket is going to read as a depression in the face simply because it's slightly darker than all of the area surrounding it on the forehead and the cheek. You don't have to overemphasize that. The little bit of dark then that you see in the eyes is going to be very dramatic. What I'm about to do now is place some of the color into the iris of the eye, starting first with the light blue and then working my way to some of the darker blue. I'd laid it in originally with just some of the dirty brush color out of the eyelash, and that color is really good enough to make the circle that goes around the outer part of the iris, but the colored part of the iris does need to be indicated. Blue eyes are generally gray blue. If you paint them with just a pure blue in that iris area, it'll look like the child has on contact lenses. You'll notice that when I mix anything from now on, I always mix it with the flesh tones in order to lighten it or darken it. I'll never touch that pile of white over on the side of my palette again throughout this entire procedure. In fact, I usually don't even put it on the palette. I'll only mix what I need for the flesh tones. This keeps me from constantly trying to work in a new value or color that won't fit with the color scheme. The eye color and the white of the eye color comes right out of mixtures made with the lightest flesh tone. Now I did indicate the pupil in that eye with a touch of plain ivory black, and the pupil needs to be centered in the iris, not halfway between the upper and lower lid. So you'll see me work quite a bit on both eyes, getting the illusion that that pupil is centered. It doesn't have to be a perfect circle. In fact, it can have unequal edges. As you see, I just softened one of those edges, and that allows me to have the illusion of the pupil. Now, the placement of that highlight is generally what you really need to make the eye look like it's made of a liquid mass, and I do that with the sharpened end of a brush, the back end of a brush, the wooden stick end. You'll notice as another trait of young children that their irises seem to be very large. Well, they are large compared to the size of their head, because when humans are born, their eyes are virtually adult size when they're born. That means that their eyeballs don't grow, but their head and the cranium that contains their head, their face, is small, and it will grow. So an eye that's already adult size in a tiny little head is going to look relatively large. So to make your subject appear youthful, you'll always want to take into account that the iris appears to be large compared to its counterpart in the adult. Now, this is large compared to the head size, not necessarily large compared to the opening in the eye, although that's going to be small too, particularly in babies. There I just added a little bit more shadow color to indicate the shape of the eye socket hole underneath all of that skin. That little bit of a vertical shaped shadow there goes a long way toward explaining the shape of the opening in the skull underneath. You'll notice that I have not painted anything dark on that lower lid. Whether it's children or adults, in a painting, you rarely, if ever, indicate the lower lid with a dark line. What you'll do is paint the iris and the white of the eye darker so that a light edge of the lower lid will appear to make a line, but it's not a dark line. Now I'm going to move to the other eye and repeat virtually the same process that I did on the other eye, or the one that we just finished. Now, neither one of these eyes are going to be, quote, finished at this point. They're not finished until we actually get to the end of the painting and have all of the features to compare it to. The eyes are so dramatic that they appear to be finished since we don't have the nose and the mouth. But once we get the nose and the mouth as far along as we have the eyes, we may feel that we need to go back and indicate just a little bit more on them. Now this offside eye, it's important to get the shape of that shadow without making it too dark. Now in children, this area is critical. If you make that too dark, you'll age them by 5 or 10 years. You'll make her eyes into adult eyes if you make that shadow to the right of that eye any darker than I've made it right now. Although I painted the first eye virtually complete before I started the second one, it's a good idea when you're working on both eyes at this point to be sure that you get them looking in the same direction, that you get the amount of dark value in the upper part of the eyelid, the same value and the same placement. Otherwise, the eyes could tend to look in different directions. This is one place where you'd want to try to paint them as close to the same as you could, because this eye, the one on the left, is not in complete shadow, so it's going to have virtually the same look as the iris and eyeball on the right. So I'm darkening the white of the eye to the left of this iris to make it feel like it's turning around into the corner. Then I'll pull the iris, the outer rim of the iris back around. And then finally a highlight in that eye, and they seem to come alive. The pupil of that eye seemed to be just a bit too large, so soften the edges of it and give it another go. Well, it's a little bit large again, so we'll need to make another adjustment. I also want to indicate the feeling of the turn of that eye with a darker edge on the outer eye socket of it as well. Remember, I increased the value on the right eye in this very place, not as dark as this because it was on the light side, to give the feeling of that opening of the eye socket into the skull. Now I'm going back and replacing the upper lash line, make it a little bit darker, and bring down a little bit of a shadow that comes into the outside corner of the eye on both eyes. Now that tends to look more equal for both eyes. The eyelids tend to have their highlight right above the sparkle in the eye. If you think about it, the sparkle in the eye takes place on the part of the eyelid that, or the eyeball itself, that projects forward toward the light. So the lid that covers it would obviously have the same type of highlight in the same place. Increasing that shadow in the eye socket, but softening it so that it feels more childlike. And adding a bit of red to it so that it doesn't have a dead look to it. You're always making a good decision to put red in any of the values that you use around the eyes. If you'll notice, I added some red to the light value around the eye on the right-hand side. So I would add it into the shadow areas of the eye on the left. Now I've worked just about as long as I can in the eye area and be able to maintain my my concentration. So very shortly I'm going to move to another part of the painting to give myself just a little bit of a rest. This is so much fun, though, painting these eyes, because this truly is the center of interest on any face. So this is where all the pleasure is, to be able to create something that looks back at you. Now I'm going to move into the area I told you, someplace different, which is the eyebrows. You'll notice that it looks like the place is already there waiting for the eyebrows. That's because we got the right value structure in the initial lay-in when we laid down the flesh tones. And it was just waiting for a little bit more color there to indicate the actual eyebrows. I laid it down with that light value, as we noted in the introduction to this program, that the eyebrows were much lighter on a child than they are on an adult. Now that's a little bit too dark, so I'll just take a dry brush and push it right into the flesh tone underneath, and guess what? It turns out just the right value. That's one reason we like to have flesh painted on and under the area that we're going to paint the eyebrows, because the flesh is very important to be there to provide that that blending solution to the eyebrows, just like the flesh out on the outer edges of the forehead need to be there in order to blend into the hair. And notice when I lay back down some heavy light value, how much darker the value in the eye socket all of a sudden looks. That's because we have hard edges between them. I'll soften those edges eventually, and it won't be so obvious. Even though I don't change the value in the eye socket, it won't seem to be as dark if I get rid of the hard edge between the light and the shadow. Now's the point that I told you I'm going to rest. You can get really kind of brain dead by working in an area as intense as those eyes are. So I use the hair area as a place to relax and renew my concentration on something that's not as critical in value and shape as the shape of the irises, for instance. If you're having a bad day fishing or playing golf, if you're a fisherman, you might change your lure. If you're a golfer, you might change the club that you're using. It's a way of getting yourself back into the swing of things and giving yourself a new way of looking. For painters, we move around the painting and paint different things as we go through. We don't paint any one thing to completion. As one teacher I've had has said, it's a way of renewing your energy. To paint in the background, for instance. I'm not going to paint any background on this little demonstration today. I'm using the hair as my resting point. And you'll notice me come back to it time and again as I work from one feature to another. So it's not because this particular area needs to be painted at precisely this moment. It's to just give me a fresh eye when I go back down to the features. Once I'm up in this area of the hair, though, I'm going to look at it very critically and say, well, have I encroached on the size of that forehead? If I have, maybe then I need to add more. Or let's have a look at the jawline and see if the jaw needs to be adjusted. Any of the areas outside of the main features of the face. And I believe that I'll work on this jawline a little bit more, giving it a little darker value where it turns in toward the hair there, and then blending into the flesh tone. Anytime you make a change, you may have to lay down paint again, but it's not as critical as it was in the beginning because you don't have to cover the canvas completely. You can make more delicate strokes, you can move the paint around more easily. As you can see, the paint is just sliding so gently even with a fresh, clean, dry brush. And to be able to do this on the wet surface is a way of being able to capture some of the delicate things that you want to be able to without having to make sure that every single stroke is exactly perfect. I think I would have to stop painting if I had to, if I put that onus on myself that every stroke had to be a perfect stroke. Gee, wouldn't we like for it to be, but each stroke is a way of making the entire painting move forward. It doesn't have to be the last time that you ever touch the area. If it is, then that's a gift and we accept it gratefully. Now I'm going in and placing some color in the cheek area. You notice that I put a little bit of color into the right side cheek, and before I leave the area I'll add color into the left side cheek. That's just to be sure that I don't forget, because in painting you do tend to lose yourself in the very area that you're painting at the moment. And if you work in the symmetrical form, that is, whatever you do to one side you do to the other side, then you don't forget to do the same things to one side as you do the other. Don't know if you noticed that last little stroke that pulled the temple area back out into the hair, but that's the kind of thing that keeps the youth in your subject. Now that the hair seems to be a bit more finished and we have more in the eyes, if you cover up the lower half of the screen with your hand, I think you'll see that it's taking on a very completed look. Even though I haven't done a lot more to blend all of the flesh tones in the forehead, for instance, than they are down in the lower area where the mouth is ultimately going to be. It's just that I've given you so much more to look at with those beautiful dominant eyes that you don't notice the fact that the paints in the area of the forehead aren't blended yet. Alright, let's go back to the hair a moment and that wide area of the forehead. I think it could still stand to be a little more dominant to create the illusion of her age. The hair has come in a little bit too dark on the right hand side, and I'm ultimately going to move that forehead out a bit on both sides, both the right and the left. Rather than using hair color, you'll notice I'm using flesh color. The flesh color is what moves it out, and it still feels like hair. The light that illuminates that forehead cascades right across the hair. Even though the hair is dark, the light on the hair is very light. There goes the flesh up into the hair on the left. This is a good thing to remember in painting all head types, whether it's women, children, men, or boys. If you can see where the hair pulls away from the forehead, it's always going to be a very soft edge, even if the hair is very, very dark and the skin is very fair, because the hair doesn't make a hard edge where it grows out of the forehead. Now when you get down below the ears, there's no hair growing out of the edge of the face unless it's a beard, so you can have a hard edge down at the jawline between the hair and the flesh, but not on the forehead or the temple area. Now I'm going back and reworking this brow area just a bit to perhaps catch a bit more of the likeness. Now if you make an error like that, I generally find that using a finger to wipe off something is just as easy many times as trying to find a clean brush. Sometimes when you're trying to make a shape, it's not the eyebrow that you need to repaint, it's the area under it or on top of it. So you see I've changed the look of the eyebrow by changing the value that surrounds it on that right hand side. I still go back to the same color of flesh that I laid down in the beginning to paint in those areas, in the turning area and in the shadow side. That's why I feel like it's a good idea to have a pile of paint of those two colors and values already pre-mixed, so you don't have to go back and try to find those colors and values. You're absolutely sure of what they are. Now's the time when I'm blending out the edge between the shadow of the eye socket and the light area. Remember I told you that I would go back and soften that, and that appears to give a wider distance between the inside corners of those two eyes. Softening the dark around the eyelids a bit more to play down the dark in that crease of the eyelid. This, I feel, is one of the most difficult parts in painting children, is to get the dark values around the eyes light enough to indicate their youth. Now I'm going back and I'm establishing more of the direct shape of the lower half of the face in preparation for painting the nose and the mouth. Observing how the light breaks into shadow, what that specific shape is part of the way that you capture the likeness of your individual subject. In a future video, we will really study likenesses in depth and the accurate types of measurements that are necessary to capture a likeness. As I said earlier, the subject of this video really is how to paint each of the features and the head in a manner that indicates the youth of the subject, rather than so much of capturing the exact likeness. It's important to get that transition between the light and shadow. Where it breaks on the face is dependent totally on how the face is turned to the light. In this case, her face was almost half in light and half in shadow, with just a tiny bit of light showing on that cheek right past the nose, the part that I'm painting right now. The north light gives it a soft, diffused effect. If I had used a spotlight, you would have seen harsh shadows cast onto the face by the nose and in the eye socket area. So by choosing natural light rather than a flashlight or a single source artificial light, I'm taking advantage of the way that we actually see faces when they're not illuminated by any kind of artificial light. And even when they are, we tend to see faces in this manner. rather than noticing sharp, hard cast shadows. Now I'm going to paint the nose more directly. I'm reestablishing the shadow side of the nose and the underplane that makes the nose tip upward from the face. So many times I see people try to paint children's noses or any noses, whether it's adults or children, without putting in this first necessary plane. Without it, the nose simply won't come forward. It'll look like the nose is mashed into the face, or worse, it'll look like a pig nose. This shadow that goes under the bottom side of the nose and establishes the outer wing corner of the lighted side of the nose is just really critically important. That's before you put in any of the openings of the nostrils. Once you put in the nostril openings, you don't tend to see the shadows. And when we're looking at someone, we don't tend to see the shadows either. All we see are the nose holes. So it's important that you not paint those first until you have the things that are under it. Then the nose will make sense. In fact, you don't ever even have to paint nostril openings if you have the value of the nose as it turns toward that upper lip painted in the correct value. Now when I paint the nostril opening, it seems to fit and it doesn't look like a pig nose. The nostril on the shadow side is generally painted darker than the nostril opening on the lighted side, and the nostril opening on the lighted side is redder for the same reason that the ears are red. The nostril protrudes from the face, and the light that strikes the outer portion of the nostril actually passes through it and illuminates the inner portion of the nostril opening. So for that reason it'll always look redder, because the light's passing through this object, the wing of the nose, that has lots of red blood in it. For that reason the light that we can see in that opening is going to appear redder. To make the nose stand away from the face, we're going to indicate the turn with the cheek color a little emphasized. Now we can go back and add a highlight or a lighter area to the top of the nose, the tip of the nose, and the wing of the nose. Notice how high up that highlight is. On each nostril wing, it's a little darker where it turns back into the face. It goes back into a depression that's topped by the smile line, which comes right out of the turn in that nose on both sides. The nostril on the left is dark on the outer edges. The nostril on the right, which faces the light, is light on the outer edges, just the opposite from each other. The shape of the shadow that comes down under the tip of the nose is kind of a little fishhook shape, and it's always there regardless of whether the nose is flat or pointed. You're going to see that shape as it comes under the tip of the nose. Sometimes it's not quite so rounded, sometimes it's a little more square, depending on your individual subject. And the nostril nearer the light is going to catch a piece of light right at the inner portion of that nostril and comes right down the little pillar of the mouth, or the philtrum. Those two little parallel lines that come out of the center of the nose there are called the philtrum. I'm further defining the falling off edge of that upper lip to set in the feeling of light and shadow as it passes across her face. One thing you don't want to do is get that philtrum area too dark, that is the little valley between the pillars of the lips. If you get it too dark, then she tends to look like she has a hair lip instead of just a little indentation up there. Now you'll notice in these areas as I work from the eyes down the nose toward the mouth, you can see that with the smaller brush and the more delicate strokes, that the face is beginning to take on a smoother appearance. Now that's not necessarily desirable. If you want to leave the face with more brush quality and richer, thicker paint, that's certainly okay, and there's nothing to prevent it from looking like a young child with thicker brushwork. What's more important is the placement of all of these features. I'm bringing up the highlight on the nose to make it appear to project further from the face, and softening the highlight again to give it some of the more youthful appearance. Now I'm using a really large, soft, sable type brush to get rid of some of the brush strokes that I see around the mouth area in preparation for painting that area. You could use a fan brush or a mop brush if you'd like to achieve this same effect. I'm also trying to lose some of the area between the jawline and the neck area. You don't have to see every edge to know it's there, and the more edges that you can soften on a child's face, the better, and the easier it is to create that illusion of youth. Some final refining touches on the nose wings to indicate their final shape. Bringing up the light on the right wing and reestablishing the curve of the cheek there will give you a better idea of the shape and placement of the nose. See, this is beside the nose, not on the nose, yet we're almost unaware that it's the cheek that's making the nose pitch forward by a change in value there. Now we're making the symmetrical side of that upper lip match the lighted right side. You see where the cheek and the lip masses have reversal of value. That is, on the right side the cheek is dark and the upper lip is light, and on the left side the cheek is light and the upper lip is dark. We're going to further set this up by reestablishing yet another time that dark value that comes down the left side of the face so that we can feel like that plane actually turns away from the light. And then we'll repaint that section between the shadow and the light, that's the turning edge, to give it a little bit more color. You'll always see more color in that edge, and you'll see more color in the cheek area toward the red tones. Even if it's totally in shadow, this area would have a bit more red tone in it. But the dominant reason that I'm adding the red here is because it's the transition color and temperature between the cool light and the warm shadow. Re-emphasizing the light that's seen on that side of the face, where the light passes across the nose and strikes that cheek. This further defines the nose with the contrast that we're indicating between the cheek and the edge of the nose. I'm now mixing a color for the lips, the color that I'm going to use to base in both the upper and the lower lip. To make a child's lips reflect their age, they really need to be fairly light in value. And if you start with the lightest value and work your way toward darker values, you're assured of keeping those lips light. If you go right in immediately with the darkest value, it's a little more difficult to bring them back up to the value that you actually need them to be. So lay that base in of the one color in value, then go in with the darker values for the upper lip. When the light is from above, the upper lip is almost always darker than the lower lip. So I'm indicating that now by adding just a little bit darker value into the upper lip and into the corners of the mouth to make the mouth vault around the face and around that shape of the teeth that is a horseshoe shape if you think about it. Now I do add a little bit darker value to the lower side to the left side of the lower lip to indicate that turn. We get a lighter value on the lighted side and a slightly darker value on the shadowed side. Softening between the flesh of the upper lip and the lower lip, trying to keep that soft turn going. Each little stroke in here can make such a difference in value and shape. Sometimes you hit it perfectly the first time, and other times you have to go back and hit it again and again. Now I could probably leave these lips right now and they would work for a child's lips with no additional detailing at all. But I am going to try to get a little bit more of the shape of her lips, which she has a very full lower lip and a fairly thin upper lip, comparatively speaking. So I'll work on that just a bit more to see if I can find that closer relationship. Generally speaking, you can add a dark in the center of the mouth and in the corners, and that's all that you'll need to indicate the feeling of youth. You lose the shape of both the upper and the lower lip and the areas between the front of the mouth and the corners. The darkness in the corners of the mouth tend to give a pleasant expression. The darker that is, the more it feels like the mouth is pulling into the beginning of a smile. So that's a trick that you can use to put a rather pleasant expression on perhaps a morose look by anyone, whether it's a child or an adult. It doesn't change the facial shape in terms of the shape of the eyes or the cheeks, but it does give the hint that perhaps a smile is beginning to form. Now the peaks of those lips should be directly under the pillars of the lips. So ultimately I'll be working on getting the peaks to come right down to the points from the little philtrum. With the paint as wet as it is underneath from its initial layer, I think you can see how easy it is to move the paint around. Now I'm going to correct that point so that it is right below that philtrum by repainting the area above it and giving it a little bit more correct shape right down the center line of the face. Don't want to get that philtrum area too dark. As I said before, we don't want to give the illusion that she has a hair lip, or worse, a mustache. The lower lip generally catches more light and has just a bit more color, so I'm adding a little bit of the Cad Red Orange to the lower lip color to get that projection, because she does have a little bit of a pouty lip. And of course it's the value that helps establish that, as well as the color. Now that color is a bit dead looking, so I need to go back and add more color to that. We certainly don't want a dead looking color in the lip area. Of the one place on the face, that's where you can take a bit of liberty and add some reddish color if you're inclined to. Of course, you can take liberties at any area in the face when it comes to color, but the lips are a natural place to add a little bit more color. Some people have naturally very red lips, and if you're a woman and you have that, then it's great because you don't have to wear lipstick all the time. Now I'm indicating that shadow shape that the bone structure makes on that lower chin area, where the lip goes back in the indentation between the lips and the chin. It's usually a little darker in that area. Again, going back and accenting the corners and the center of the mouth to give us the vault of the mouth around that shape. And a final highlight on the side of the lips that face the light. We need to get a little soft turning edge there at the bottom of the lips, so I'll put on a light and then come back with a dark right next to it and see if we can't get that little ridge that appears right at the lower edge of the lips. Sometimes that little ridge is very prominent depending on the age of the subject. Now I'm moving into some of the finishing areas, pulling that little chin forward by virtue of its light value, and then connecting it back to the light by replacing some of that light value. The light also goes right up into the corner of the mouth, which will help to set up her expression. Once I put a light up there right under the corner of the mouth, notice how her expression seems to change. But first, I'm again losing some of those edges between the jawline and the value under on the neck. Any softening you can do where two values seem to be the same will help in the illusion of creating the feeling of youth and smooth skin. There's that hard edge that I was telling you about earlier. The one place that you can have a very sharp edge. That helps to push the hair back and thrust the head forward in front of the hair. Same thing on the other side. Very, very important area. And since I'm in a little bit of the hair color, I'm going to go back and make some final touches on the hair. Give the feeling of those braids pulled back unevenly. Even a little bit of highlight on the hair. The light coming in the window was cool blue window light, so the blue is appropriate for highlighting the area of the hair that faces the light. Highlights are always the same temperature of the light that's illuminating the subject, and in this case, it's very cool. And that little antenna-looking affair there and the extra dot, I'm just simply going to remove with a damp paper towel, damp with turp, of course. If I were painting a background around this, I would simply paint it out rather than turp it out. Now I'm going back and softening the edges of the mouth, of the bottom lip rather, that go into the corner of the mouth. The lips are, after all, flesh, and they don't want to be very hard-edged. Now here's that area I was speaking of earlier. The light that is captured in the corner of the mouth tends to give a pleasant expression, just like the dark of the corner of the mouth captures what appears to be the beginning of a smile. So that's a trick that you can use to give your subject a more pleasant expression. Same thing is true on the other side. If that little cheek rolls forward because the mouth is being pulled back, then it'll have a bit more light on it. It also gives the illusion of that little bit of a beginning of a smile. Going back and replacing the light, so I get the feeling of the light coming across the nose. That tends to thrust the nose even further forward, if you'll notice. And as wet as this is, I think I'll need to use my softer brush to get rid of some of the brush marks to make it fall in with the rest of the flesh tones. Now I'm going to return to the eyes. You may think that they're just fine, and actually they probably are. But I'm going to take down the size of the irises just a bit so that it feels a bit more like the likeness of the subject that I'm painting. And once I cut down the size of the iris of one, I'll certainly have to do it on the other, but let's approach one at a time. You always have to look at the shape that you're creating in both eyes, not just one. So the iris now on the left seems quite a bit larger than the one on the right. And in a way they almost seem to be looking in different directions once I made that slight change in the one on the left. So I'm going to have to narrow the one on the left a bit more. And once I take out a bit of its width, then the pupil is no longer in the center, so that requires me to repaint the pupil so that I do center it. Maybe even a little bit more of the color in the outside of the iris. And as a result of all of that, I think that I've now have the highlight in that eye in the wrong place. So ultimately, I'm going to have to repaint the highlight in the eye and get a little bit more light in the lower half of the iris. So it feels like it's capturing the light that's coming across the bridge of that nose. There, that's lighter. And I can emphasize that by repainting the rim around the outer edge of that iris so that I can see that a little more strongly. There. Now I'm going to remove the highlight in the eye and repaint it so that it's more nearly like the placement of the highlight in the other eye. Again, using the sharpened end of my brush handle, I'll put a dot of the number 1 or your first lightest flesh mix. To highlight that, but I'm not. You notice throughout the painting I've not used any other white or anything lighter than what's in that lightest flesh tone mix. Now our little model did have on a little red t-shirt of some kind, so I'm going to go ahead and indicate a bit of color just to close off the flesh tone so that we know that it's not just hanging there in space. Little vignettes like this are really fun to paint, and parents love to have little paintings like this that are totally or not totally finished. They feel like paintings, and if you're just beginning as a portrait painter or a painter of children or humans of any age, this is a good way to get started without the added difficulty of what to figure out to put in the background. If you just use a toned surface of your canvas and add just a tiny little bit of a neckline to your subject, you'll be amazed at how marketable some of these little vignettes might be, and a good way to get you started into portrait painting if you've not considered it before. And with that, our demonstration is complete. Let's look at a group of still photographs of this painting demonstration as it progressed from the beginning to the end. I hope you've learned some of these important points that indicate youth when you're painting young children. Look first to see where the eyes are located on the head. In the very young, eyes are located below the halfway mark. Notice that the shadow down the length of the nose is not continuous. It's a broken shadow. Young children have relatively large irises. Young children also have very rounded skull forms, both in the top of the head and the jawline. Children typically have lighter eyebrows than they do when they're adults. All children have large foreheads compared to the lower half of their face. The lips in children are very soft-edged. And the younger the child, the narrower the neck is compared to the width of the head and the body.
I hope you've enjoyed today's demonstration and that you'll join me for another of the Illumination series. Until then, enjoy painting.